So welcome to today's webinar. Today, I am delighted to have with me Elizabeth Sawyer, who is the CEO of Bennett School Placement Worldwide. She was raised in England and Ireland until the age of 10 and is an international hybrid like many of the students that she serves. She brings over a decade of teaching experience in 3 languages to her work at Bennett, where she was a consultant of all trades, working with families, moving internationally into and within the US, prior to assuming leadership of the company in 2009. So welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I am really excited about this one because as you have discovered in my conversation prior to making this webinar, I am pretty passionate about getting school placement right. We have been through it ourselves, and I have seen a ton of people get it right and a ton of people get it wrong. And I think information and planning is key to this. So I'm really, really excited that you've joined us to bring your expertise to this summit.
Well, thank you. And it's nice to be here. And as you already know, I am always willing to talk about education and school placements around the world. So
everyone has just come on the webinar, but just so you know, Elizabeth and I have been chewing the fat for about half an hour. In very high-pitched tone of voice.
That's right.
So we've got that out of our system, so we can leap straight into the content. So tell me a little bit about the benefits and challenges. I know you wanted to talk about the challenges first, because I think this is something that trips parents up, and it's also something that we are terrified of getting wrong, I think.
Right. So the benefits and challenges of kind of the nomadic expat life.
Absolutely, yes.
In terms of education?
Yes, and what you see, the people that you work with facing, and you know what, I guess at the end of the day, sorry, I'm burbling, but to me it's about what your service fixes, because clearly there is a challenge there that is your service.
Right. We wouldn't exist if there weren't, right?
Yeah, it's not that easy.
Okay, well, as you and I were talking about a little bit before, I think we can divide a lot of these things into sort of a very practical and a logistical component, and then there's also an emotional and psychological component. And so I will tend to focus a little bit more on the practical and the logistic versus the emotional, but while acknowledging that that's very real too. So in terms of the challenges, I think for families moving kids between countries and between education systems, on the logistics side of things, you know, you have kids who may change schooling systems many times over the course of their academic career, and there are a lot of wonderful aspects to that, and I will talk about those too. I think some of the challenges, though, are the obvious ones that come from lack of continuity. So, you know, you start off in an English system and you're preparing perhaps eventually for your GCSEs, and then all of a sudden you relocate somewhere where there's not an English school, and all of a sudden you're going to do IB, except then guess what? You're being moved again to the US and there's no appropriate IB school where you are, so all of a sudden you have to adjust to an American curriculum, and that's a big ask for a lot of kids. So I think those are the challenges, and I think we're going to talk about long-term versus short-term, probably separately, but I think long-term planning for those kinds of things is very important.
You alluded actually in that to the academic and support continuity, that this constant changing of curriculum, and I completely agree with that. We talk to people about the emotional a lot, but I think we underestimate until we're in it just how complicated the changes are. And even when you fix it and get your child into a school, they still have to then fix it.
Yeah, they have to do the work of adjusting.
I think that's huge. And I think that's something that, again, if we plan in advance, you can actually smooth it a lot.
Right.
And then we'll be talking to Tracy and Katie from International Diagnostic Solutions, and they talk about how you can put in support continuity. But those to me are pieces that we often underestimate.
Yes.
We think we've got it fixed when we get our child into school once they walk through the door.
You're absolutely right.
The challenge is just starting.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, it's most obvious when it's obvious, such as, you know, you only speak Japanese or you only speak French, and all of a sudden you're in a school where the language of instruction is English. And so that's a very obvious kind of lack of continuity, but it becomes a lot more subtle, and often the disjunctures really reveal themselves when you repatriate, because or you send your child home to university, or think you're going to send your child home to university, and that will be possible. So yes, a lot of demands on kids in there, both the emotional side and also just, you know, on the very practical side.
Yeah, we've had, my son actually, I remember we just moved from Los Angeles to San Francisco within the California state. And even in those two school systems, classes that he had taken as a middle schooler that were high school classes that were recognized academically in Los Angeles weren't recognized. It was quite really hard to get them recognized in San Francisco. And it was just, it was one of those things you didn't see it coming.
Right. Why would you, right?
When it came to college application 4 years later, they needed, you know,
there was a credit missing or something like that.
They needed 4 years of science. And so it was one of those things, thank goodness we had made sure it was on there.
Right.
But it would have been a huge problem, and he would have potentially ended up replicating a class in the same country, in the same state, which
and maybe during the summer, a fate worse than death.
Yeah. Talk to me a little about academic and cultural reintegration, because I know that's something that you feel quite strongly about.
I do. That's my soapbox, so you may have to muzzle me. I think, you know, people go on assignment for the first time and they may think it's going to be 2 years and then they're going to go home. And the reality is that most people, once they're out on the internationally mobile circuit, most people don't go home when they thought they were going to go home. And often that sort of quick exposure that you were going to give your kids to a school system somewhere else turns into many years of very varied education. And I think somewhere, I mean, most of the parents we talk with, you know, they may say, well, you know, we don't really know where our child will go to university, but most of them sort of assume that they'll go back to home country for university. And that is often something that really needs planning for ahead of time. And for many families, and I think it's human nature, you know, you're excited about what's right in front of you and the next adventure, and you have a lot of pressure on you to make it happen and make it fast and, you know, find a school. And I think that where people sometimes run into difficulty is that they're not doing long-term planning. They're not finding out exactly, you know, if you're going back to Australia and you're hoping to have your child go to Australian university as an Australian, what are the exact credentials that you need coming out of a US high school if you want to study law? And how are they different from what would have been expected if you'd been coming out of secondary school in Australia? And knowing that 2 years ahead of time and planning for it. Or, you know, if you want to go to university in England and you're coming out of the US and you don't have an IB, what are the requirements of in terms of AP courses? What do you need to be able to produce in terms of AP results, SAT, ACT scores? And how many years ago should you have been planning for that? And so most corporations moving families around do not provide any kind of financial support when families repatriate. They don't provide it in education anyway. They will provide for private or international school perhaps while on assignment, but not when you go home. And my feeling is that's when a lot of families need the help because they may have burnt their bridge to their home country system without realizing it. So that's a big soapbox.
Yes, it's funny, isn't it? One of the characteristics you often see cited as being an expat necessity is flexibility. But in that, people haven't really thought beyond the, oh yes, we can problem solve, but we're always doing it reactively. We're never doing it proactively. And one of the things that most of my work is about, in strange ways, but most of the stuff that I do is about building in a plan B,
Yeah.
always having plan B, because the number of times you use it are countless. You just continually are having
Yeah.
to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think cultural integration comes into that too. I notice that there is a whole Facebook page, I Am a Triangle, which is a wonderful Facebook group. And they talk about repatriation. And I think, you know, those are all mainly adults talking about the challenges that they have faced going back. And I think children face the same.
Oh, absolutely.
Into the school system. My children identify themselves as Welsh. My daughter has an American accent and hasn't lived in Wales since she was 4. My son since they were 8. Now, they are going to have, we do go back regularly, and that's something that we have planned in because we always want them to at least have that ability to code switch. But I think they would be surprised just how Welsh they are, how American they are. And it's that falling between two stools, because when we're in the US, everyone sees the British parts of them.
Right.
But when we're in the UK, everyone sees the American parts, but they're not in the UK often enough to know how big those pieces are.
Right. And that's very true. And I think anybody who's, especially as a child, if you've lived a little bit between countries and so forth, that's a very familiar feeling. And it, as I was saying, it also happens in the most practical sense, in addition to the emotional sense, where you can end up, and I keep drawing on England and the US because there's so much expat traffic between those two countries, and we're very familiar with that, but it could be anywhere. You know, you could go through all these systems and end up finishing secondary school without a diploma or a certificate from anywhere. And, you know, we've had that of families sort of said, we started here, we ended up here, and, you know, all of a sudden here we are, we can't get a US diploma because we don't have an American history credit. But we missed GCSEs in England, and we are neither fish nor fowl, as they say, from the education standpoint.
And let's be honest, those things are stressful. You know, A-levels, GCSEs, as they are now, showing my age. GCSEs, A-levels, SATs, ACTs. As I say those words, there will be parents in America and the UK going, like rolling their eyes, because they are stressful enough at the best of times, as is the college application process.
Yes.
The thought of going through it without the supporting documents and the supporting evidence, to me, is just horrific. I cannot imagine how stressful that must be.
Right. And, you know, to go back to your original question of the challenges, sort of the pros and cons and the challenges, I will also say that, you know, not to sound too dark about it, it's also an incredible experience for kids, you know, to experience different school systems and to be, I think of it, you know, some of the international schools that I have visited, where, you know, there are kids in your classroom from all over the world, and you are completely at ease by virtue of who you are, kind of learning from them, being with them, being, you know, really imbibing an international community. Not only do you have the opportunity, but you have the ability by virtue of who you've been enabled to be. And
I am laughing because that was going to be my next point. Having painted this really bleak, the good news is that it absolutely is worth it if you plan well. There are so many benefits.
Yes. And so that's it exactly. Just to sort of plan and think as you're doing it, and don't rely on your corporation who's moving you to just somehow make everything right for you at the last minute, or, you know, they're not keeping their eye on this piece of coursework in this system versus that piece of coursework there. That piece of parental responsibility should never be relegated.
Mm-hmm. You also talk about the access to a broad educational menu, and that's something we came from, you know, some rural Wales, where the academic opportunities were not, you know, IB programs weren't necessarily part of the option. Some of the things that my children have been exposed to, languages actually is a really good example. They do have access to so many opportunities and potentially a really high standard of educational choice and provision. It was a very slow word coming out, provision.
Well, and of course that always depends, you know, on what company you're with and where you're moving to and how many how many different appropriate schooling options exist for you as a student in a given location. And so, you might be, we've worked with companies where they send everybody to one remote location and there's one little school. And if that's not a fit, oof, that's a tough one. But in many situations, students are going to wonderful international schools that have very diverse students, faculty, curricular offerings, and they may be receiving kind of a higher level of education than they would have received if they were at home. And frankly, bluntly put, the corporation weren't funding their education. And so I think, it can vary enormously. I mean, as I say, there are the kids who end up in locations and what's on offer isn't great, and they would have been better off at home. But there are many times when the educational experience that you can have in an international school is so rich, and it's also very specific. When that's your world, you don't realize till you come out of that world just how specific it was. If you've grown up assuming a kind of global mindset and that you have kids from all over the world in your classroom, and you're as comfortable eating Moroccan food as you are sushi, and hearing languages, you're not aware of how rich and different that opportunity is till you end up in suburban wherever, with locals in whatever country you might end up in, and you're the one person who's had this strange and varied experience.
And if you wanted to hear more about that, Ruth Van Rieken kicked off the summit, and she talked so beautifully about the benefits, but the benefits of growing up in that particular environment, and how enriching it is, and how it fundamentally changes you. So if you are wanting to find out a bit more about the concept of growing up as a third culture kid or a cross culture kid, watch Ruth's video. It's
absolutely,
it's fascinating, and straight from the horse's mouth, from the woman who was instrumental in really bringing that to the forefront. So I'm going to skip straight to the strategies for success, because I think we've embedded a lot of the implications. People, hopefully, if they're watching this, will already now have a really good understanding of why they need to be paying attention to this next section. So,
good.
I'm sure if it was me watching it, I'm already with my ears pricked up thinking, I need to take notes. So think and plan long term. We've talked about this. It kept coming up in our conversations when we were planning this webinar. We both see the long-term aspect as being crucial.
Yes.
More about that.
So I would say, from a very practical standpoint, as you're going on assignment or your next assignment, is to pause in the process and say, how long is this assignment going to be? How many years do we have before X? Either I want my children to go back to Brazil, and I expect that they will finish up secondary in Brazil and do the vestibulario exam, in which case, what are you doing to maintain their Portuguese? Not only their spoken Portuguese, but their reading and their writing. Or, the examples that we've used of you're planning on university in X country, to sit down and really do the research of what is going to be required for your children, because that may necessitate conversations with your employer. You might need to say, I know this was going to be a 3-year assignment, but could we make it either a 2-year or a 4-year, but not a 3-year, because I can't go back to England in year 11. Can't be done. You can't enter the English system in year 11. That's the second year of GCSEs. So that very kind of basic academic planning.
I will heartily support that, because we have always tried to keep the kids' options open, because we were never completely sure where we would be, and knew we could read the writing on the wall when they were younger, because our very first assignment was supposed to be 1 year and it extended to 3, and so that for me was the writing on the wall that we couldn't predict. So we've always tried to keep their options open, made sure that we kept information that might be relevant to the college application system in the UK. I kept up to date on that. And I've also contacted universities nationally to see what their requirements are before we actually made choices, so that we didn't necessarily have all the ducks in the row, but at least I knew where the ducks were.
Well, exactly. And the fact that you said you kept researching, because things change. For example, in the last couple of years, laws in England have changed about residency requirements for attending university, that a student, in order to not be classified as international, has to have been a resident for 3 years.
And we have lost out on that. That was one of the things that I was very clear on, was that we suddenly, from having gone to a system, because the US is phenomenally expensive to send you to university.
Right.
It's in a painful fashion. And that's something that we don't, I'm sorry, I'm going to get slightly off the topic, but one of the things that I ask people when I talk about long-term planning, they say, well, we don't know where we're going to be. And my instant comeback is, do you want your children to be able to go to college?
Right.
And they say, well, yes. And I said, have you got the money to pay for it? Because I know how much we are paying for my son to go to college in the US, and we didn't have the, 529, I think it is, isn't it? There's the college fund, the tax-free college fund that people here routinely put in place. We didn't have that. So we knew if we were going to have to pay through the nose.
Right.
And everyone will say, oh, well, there's college loans and there's this and there's that. Not necessarily, because you may not tick the box in terms of residency, credit access. So it is those long-term pieces that if you want your child to go to college, it's not just the academics. You need to have the money in place, and you need to keep track of what's happening in your home country.
Keep updating, because things change. So that would be my first thing, would be to say, as you're going on assignment, think beyond that assignment to the long term, and then back up, because the long term may dictate what you do in the short term. If you sort of say, and this is an obvious example, but you say, we should really, IB, now that I think about it, IB is more important than I was really focusing on. And so in this new location, we're only going to look at IB schools. And, it could be something as simple as that. So I would say that, put the long term right beside the immediate term. I would also say, don't rely on the hearsay of others who are well-intentioned, but have very different children, very different experiences from yours. Do your own research. So if, your colleagues say, oh, don't go to that school, that's an awful school, my children had an awful time there, you would hate that school. Listen to that, and then put it aside and do your own research with your child in mind. Every child is different. Every family culture is different. Everybody's experience, put 5 people in the same location and they'll have 5 different experiences. So do your own research with your child in mind. And by all means, factor in what you hear, but think about your family and your children as you think about an appropriate school. And as part of that, I always say to families, try to visit a school before you enroll your children if you possibly can. And many times it's not possible for a million reasons, but international, I always say, and international is a word that has not been patented, and there's no set definition to what an international school means. Ideally, it means international in faculty, in student demographic, and in curriculum in some way, and it should have an international component in all 3. But many schools, I could hang out a placard tomorrow and say Elizabeth's International School because I talk to kids in French twice a day for 10 minutes, but that wouldn't make it really an international school. And so what does a school mean when it's international? Anyway, I'm going down another whole track there, of course, but schools, many schools, international schools increasingly are for profit. They are bought and sold by school holding companies all over the world all the time, which doesn't mean they're bad schools, but they need to be vetted carefully. And so a school could be very different in reality from how it appears on a website.
Well, that was going to be my point, is that the difference in terms of what they say, what they espouse, what they say they are doing and what they're providing, and the reality. And some of that is just practical. You can't hold it against them because international schools never know what's coming. They never know who's coming to the door.
Right.
They don't have the advantage of watching to see, you know, the children that are coming up in the local primary school that will be heading to secondary school. They don't know. They don't. There will be some indicators, but there is no guarantee as there is who will make up that school. The other thing I wanted to just interject when you're talking about researching the school, this is again from a personal perspective, that your children may end up going to different schools. That's it, and not to do with their age, but to do with their needs. Because I had that in our own family, and our very good friends in Kenya, we had 4 children between the 2 families in 4 different schools because they all needed different things to thrive.
Absolutely. And, you know, we get the question all the time from our corporate clients, well, you're going to charge, these are twins, are you going to charge us for 2 kids? And that kind of epitomizes the view of one end. Everybody just goes to the same school. And that's a very good point, that obviously for logistical reasons, it would be great in a family if all 3 kids could be in one school and you know, have one commute for everybody and so forth. But I think that's a very good point. You know, you have to look at your kids as individuals, and each one with very, very specific needs. And
with different with different educational trajectories as well, because the one that you have, you know, the one that was 12 when you left the UK to go and live in Botswana may have a very British identity, but the one that was born in Botswana may well not be interested in going to university in the UK. It is completely alien. So it's really interesting how you do have to map out that whole...
That's very, very true. That's very true. I was 12 when I moved to this country. My brother was 16. So I would pretty much consider myself American now with European background. But for him, it's the reverse. He then ended up in Europe for 25 years after education. And for him, it would be that he's European with some American background. And I think it's all because of that 4-year difference between us, you know, that I was just 4 years younger. So this became home. So,
I have exactly the same. My son is 4 years older than my daughter, and I would say utterly the same. And that all the predictions aside, I wouldn't have predicted the choices he made. But the other thing that I did notice is that he didn't go back to the UK, but he also didn't think in state when it came to college. So planning I would have done, you know, thank goodness I kept our options open because he was looking globally. He felt that, you know, the world was his oyster. They come out of these schools with a global mindset, and then they use it.
An example of the upside of the academically varied and rich experience. I can go anywhere in the world to study.
Yeah. You know? Just terrifying from the person writing the text. So visit the school, but then also don't assume enrollment. Because sorry.
So do your own school visits. Don't rely completely on the advice of colleagues and friends, although it may be very helpful to do your own child-specific research. Likewise, don't rely on your corporation to sort of always take care of things for you. In certain locations, corporations have an understanding with certain schools that will give their students priority. But I think to approach, you know, your application and enrollment process with full responsibility for your children is a wise approach.
And I know that IDS Alliance, again, they talk about sometimes that schools will say no, but for very good reasons, because they can't meet the needs of your child. And so that you may have to adjust, you may have to get outside support, you may have to get it, and it can be anything from, you know, they don't do tennis at the school and your child is a tennis prodigy. There's some very good stuff going on, but if we do that, I think we tend to think of when we're paying schools that we think they should meet every need. And actually, when our children go to school at home locally, we would expect to, you know, add mop-up services where they need tutoring, or, you know, where we're going to have to go and I don't know, teach them to swim.
Yeah.
So I think we have to assume the same thing.
Right, and that's a very good point, because I think that, and for people who are listening who have been in the international school world for years, obviously you already know this, but for many people who are new to an assignment, for example, they may say, wow, that international school, $35,000 a year or however many pounds or whatever, and will therefore assume that it will have absolutely everything on offer. And so, for example, in an age when there are a lot more special needs diagnoses, many international schools have very, very little support on offer. And it could be, depending on where you're coming from, that you've gotten used to the support that your local state system offers you, which is way more than you would actually have on assignment. So that, especially in the context of special needs, it's very important to know what schools can offer and what they can't. And IDS is a fantastic resource for families who are going to places where there may be limited options, because they can essentially step in and provide things remotely. But yes, so that's a very good example of where you have to do your homework. And don't assume anything. And
also my final is that I put adjust as necessary, but I know people who have moved their children to a different school. We tend to think that because we move so often that we have to get it right first time. And then we almost overinvest in the schools, when sometimes you don't know about a school that's available locally. It might be a small community run one. It might be homeschooling for a year because your child is struggling to, I don't know, find time to fit in that tennis project. Right. But I do think it's really important to remember that this isn't a black and white, all or nothing, that you can, if your child isn't thriving, it's just important to meet those needs, right, whether they be academic, whether they be emotional, whether they be practical, you can adjust.
Right. Yes, and I think, like with so many things, it's about finding the balance between allowing time for adjustment and encouraging and enabling it, but also acknowledging when it's not working and when you have to take action and can't be complacent.
Yes, I'm just thinking there will be people watching this call who will suddenly have you on speed dial because they've suddenly realized that they're missing some piece of the puzzle in their current school for their child to go to university back home.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I do think, if you feel like that you're not getting it right, I think the first place to start is the school where you've landed. And to say, what kinds of resources are here that we could avail ourselves of to make this transition work? And that's your first stop. And then if that doesn't work, then maybe you look outside the school. And then if it's still not working, then maybe you do need to think about other options and so forth. But like I said, it is about that balance. I mean, adjustment takes time. And you pointed out very articulately earlier on that, the paperwork gets done, the child gets enrolled, and kind of our work is done. But that's when the kids' work, the students' work really begins, of walking through those new school doors and making new friends and getting to know new teachers and conceivably adjusting to an entirely new education system. And that takes time.
When you're thinking and planning long term, one of the things that I have really noticed is that there is a challenge that we constantly face is this fragmentation of documentation, that often we've moved cross border and we've lost the transcript, that piece of paper that proved this. So tell me what you suggest families do to fix that.
Right. And that's it's an obvious piece, but it's so crucial, it's worth commenting on, that just to sort of have your documents in order and to keep track of them is very important. And on our website, we have a list of what we call the education passport. And it could literally be, get yourself a nice bright folder that you're not going to lose in your relocation, and you keep it in your carry-on and you don't put it in the truck that's taking your household goods, and to keep an ongoing log of actual documents or where you can access them. So transcripts from each school, perhaps course descriptions if a school can give you those to keep on file. If you're moving a student near the end of secondary and you're going to need teacher comments and references, get the name, the email addresses, the phone numbers of people you're going to need to contact a year from now. Get them now and keep them. And just keep adding to that folder so that when you arrive somewhere and they say, okay, we need the last 2 years of grades, we need teacher recommendations, which may have to go straight from the teacher to the school and not through you, but possibly not. We need the latest TOEFL exam results, or we need, just to have one place where you have it all together and you carry it with you and you keep adding to it as you go.
And actually, I know as someone who is currently going through the college application process again, things like voluntary work, your extracurricular activities, all of that evidence and certification, they're huge when you need to apply for college and you're trying to remember all of that stuff. And you can actually say which awarding body it was, because that's the problem. Often when you get a form to fill in, there's a box that requires the accrediting body, and you've no idea because it was 4 years ago and 3 moves ago.
Right. That's a very good point. Yes, with each chapter of wherever you are, to add the page that has all of that miscellaneous, sang in the choir for 3 years, or was given an award by such and such an organization for X activity. And just to kind of keep that list going with you.
Yes, because I know when I worked in college, increasingly educational institutions are allowing for accreditation for prior learning. You will see APL or APE accreditation for prior experience. And it's something that you may not think will be allowed, but if you've got all the documentation and all the details there, they may well take that into consideration and allow, entry somewhere, use it.
Right, absolutely. And, the other thing is, let's face it, when you're moving and you suddenly, wow, I'm going on assignment to X location. I don't think we've ever had a client who said to us, we're moving this family and, they have all the time in the world. It doesn't work that way. They say, we need them there in 2 weeks. They have to be in school in 2 weeks, help them out. So just because realistically, families will be doing this late at night when schools are closed. They will be doing it, on the weekend when they can't call a school and ask for a transcript. And you're doing it and you're rushed and you're stressed. And where's my passport anyway? So. And
you don't have Wi-Fi because you're in some transitory accommodation and you don't really want your really private documents over a public printer or Wi-Fi system.
Right.
The other thing that I got caught out by was moving from a nationalized healthcare system where everything was paid for and everything was centrally recorded to the US, where suddenly we had to show evidence of vaccinations.
Right.
That really caught me out because there are certain things in the UK, like chickenpox.
Right.
You don't have a vaccination, you have chickenpox. And so trying to prove that my child had had a vaccination because she hadn't. Right. And then actually having to get
a doctor's letter, proof of what they call it, proof of
evidence of infection or something, or evidence, which sounds terrible.
Right.
But again, that was 2 moves before. That wasn't a recent move. So that's something that is hugely problematic when you arrive, and it's just miserable when your first day you roll up to school and you've turned up on the doorstep and they say, well, have you got your vaccination records?
Right.
No, and it takes you a week or 2 to get it. Meanwhile, everyone else has started school.
Right.
And that's not a oh, well, never mind, we'll let them in. That's a no.
Right. The US vaccine schedule is different from that of most other countries in that there's a hepatitis series that students have here that in most countries they don't have. And it's 3 vaccines and you have to have had the first one. So yes, as a piece of that education passport, to have an updated health vaccination record in there. It's funny, just like, even as an adult, when you fill out a form to do something and somebody wants to know when was your last tetanus shot, I mean, I don't know if it's for my own children, for myself. I'm always having to go and find when somebody had their last tetanus shot.
My phrase is usually, but that again is something that when you arrive, you've then got to find an urgent care clinic or someone to give you the vaccinations if you haven't had them.
Right.
The other thing to bear in mind is that if that is the case, there are certain exemptions. There are often exemptions within the schools. And if you do have a child with health issues, you might want to bear that in mind, that there may be a lot of children exempt. I'm sorry, I'm burbling slightly, but I know in California you can have religious exemptions from certain vaccinations. But I also know a friend whose child had an immunodeficiency virus would specifically avoid schools where there would be, religious schools, for instance, where potentially there was a high population of children who were exempt from taking and had chosen not to be vaccinated.
Right. And yes, and schools can vary on this because they know who their own student population is. And there are some schools that will say, in the US, for example, without that first hepatitis vaccine, no. And other ones that they simply want to know what you're doing and what your schedule is, but they're not going to be draconian in terms of not letting you in the door. But yes, that is another logistic to be managed.
Okay. And sometimes you do have to go back to your company and talk to HR, talk to Global Mobility, and potentially renegotiate, or know exactly in the next move what you do need to advocate for, what you do need.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And as I said, we may work. I think we work with a select sample of corporations by virtue of the fact that they hire us, because de facto they're already companies, therefore, who acknowledge how crucial the education piece of relocation is. If you don't get it right, the assignment will fail. And then you have $1 million investment perhaps down the drain. And so whether they're more humanistic or whether they're just thinking long-term financially more clearly, whatever, but the companies that we work with, they get this. They understand that this is a piece that needs to be tended to, or their relocations are going to be, at the very least, potentially financially not wise.
We talked about this before as well, that sometimes it's not the companies. The companies, all they are able to do is provide funding for it. But I think if you're going to take anything away from this webinar, we've talked about long-term planning as being one of our key, but so often we see parents breaking what is a very successful school career so far, in terms of, you need to think about whether that assignment is going to completely disrupt your child's, pre-university year, or the pre-university exams, or their, entry curriculum, or because I think we go into this, we want our children to have international experience. We want them to see the world. We're often doing these moves partly for our family to travel the world and get the most out of it. And then it's almost as if, because we're not paying enough attention, we break it at the final hurdle, and our children get really understandably very cross. I know something that my own children talk about. We stopped here, and it hasn't been probably the soundest career move, but the children have made enough moves. We're in a place where they get great education and they have built their own opportunities. And so that's our commitment. We're stopping for a while. And, if one party has to go and work overseas by themselves, so be it. But for instance, my husband doesn't get the choice. He's had the luxury of his family accompanying him on this career journey. He doesn't get it for this final bit.
Well, that's a huge piece of it, obviously. And that's this whole world of emotional life. And, something I have observed in working with a lot of families is that every parent moving a child feels guilt. In that, even if it's a wonderful opportunity that your children are going to be given, they're leaving, they're being uprooted. And as they get older, that gets harder and harder. And families deal with that in different ways. And I think it's very hard. There are many, we've had families where the company has said, no, I'm sorry. There's no longer a job for you. We thought it would be a 3-year assignment. And, the project you were working on, the funding has stopped. I mean, look at what the oil situation has done in the oil industry, right? We're going to repatriate you early. But my kid is halfway through his IB diploma.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's no longer a job. And, you have workers who have led this life, building their careers and doing it for their families, who all of a sudden their backs are to the wall, and what are they supposed to do? And then other times, maybe they do have more flexibility, and it's just that job looks really nice, and that was that promotion that I always wanted, and man, I have to choose between that and the wrath of my kids, because they're not going to forgive me if I move them again. And that's where it becomes, very personal and very much about family culture and the dynamics within a family and all of that. But, we watch it from the outside and with compassion, kind of say, oof, and we see a lot of angst, a lot of very understandable angst as families try to make these decisions.
Yes, because I'm really lucky. We talk from a position where we have a certain amount of control, but so many families don't have control. But there is, I think the bottom line is that you're not the first person to go through this.
Right.
You won't be the last, and there is a ton of information and help out there and support out there, but you have to be really proactive, don't you?
Yes, you do. And it's, these are your kids, it's their education, you're their parent, you can bring in help, you can bring in professional help, you can bring in friends, you can bring in your corporation, but ultimately, that taking the reins can have just a huge effect in terms of how much more smoothly it goes.
Yes.
Versus sort of saying, oh, it'll be fine, we won't be going home for years, they don't really need to maintain their Russian or their, or, that's years off, that's years away, we don't have to think about that yet.
And what's fascinating actually is from the flip side, having both of us worked in education, that when people turn up on your doorstep needing help, that having a parent come in advance and say, this is the situation, this is what we have, where can we go forward? Universities, I know, are becoming increasingly flexible. They're recognizing that, the global community that is now accessing their services. Yeah. And so there is flexibility there. So if you're watching this and going, oh my God, I've never planned, I've got it all wrong, don't panic. We're talking about being proactive, but also the other side of it, services, schools, colleges are becoming much more flexible and are willing to work with you, because that's what they do. They want children to have a great education.
You're absolutely right. And that's a very good point. If you're listening and if you're starting to panic, don't. It'll be okay. Rachel, you're absolutely right. Even in the last 6 or 7 years, while I've been doing this, I've seen just greater fluidity, between education systems and between institutions. And we all say all the time, everything is becoming more global. And this is one of the ways in which that's good. That kind of international study is just standard now for many populations all over the world. And so it is becoming easier.
And STEAM is very valued as well. It is your child's experience, while at times educationally may not be ideal, and we are trying to get you to plan in advance, but the actual international experience is seen as so valuable.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your work, how you work with families and what services you provide.
Okay. We work primarily with families who are relocating and helping them identify what would be a good fit school for their children wherever they're going, and looking at that in terms of the long term for that student, the specific academic profile and emotional profile of that particular student, and then also the preferences of the family. So our work is primarily working with families. We're usually hired by their corporations to work with them, although we do also work with families who come to us privately. But typically a corporation is moving somebody from A to B, and they bring us in as one of the services and benefits. And we help the family, choose and navigate the schooling piece. We also work a lot with their corporations, and it might be it could be anything from surveying an area for a corporation to say, here are the international schools that are on offer. This is how the landscape looks educationally if they're planning a group move, and maybe doing research ahead of time in terms of what kind of special needs support is available in a given location somewhere in the world, because that may affect their recruiting for families that they will send to that location. So we do a lot of strategic work with corporations. We also do a lot of assessment work with corporations who they may say, well, we have a policy that in X location, we don't cover private school. And a family comes forward and says, well, we really need it because we have a different set of circumstances. And so we will often assess the situation, talk with the family, look at the company's policy, and make a recommendation as to whether or not an exception should be granted. And then we're both the good guy and the bad guy. If we sort of say, look, we think the family would be okay without this benefit, then the family can be mad at us instead of global mobility. Or we might go to the company and say, this family really has a good reason for asking for this, and you really need to step up and pay for X, Y, Z for this family. And then I guess we're kind of the bad guy then for the company. But
I was just going to say,
at least they had confirmation of what the employee was saying from an unbiased source.
But again, from a family perspective, I am thinking if you have that information beforehand, that
yes.
potentially you will or won't receive that support.
Yes.
It's so much more helpful because you can plan. And I'm assuming that you don't just ditch the family. Having said that, what you do is recommend alternatives.
Right. Oh, yes. The other day I spoke on the phone with a gentleman who was trying to decide whether or not to take this assignment. It happened to be an assignment in the US. And, his bottom line, and the real work with him will come later. But first, what he wanted to know is, given the ages of his daughters, could he come from England to the US, do a 4-year assignment, and have them be able to go back to the UK? And so we were looking at his daughters' profiles and who they are academically and where they would be living. And he basically sort of cut me off and said, Elizabeth, bottom line, is it doable? I said, it's doable. He said, fine, I'll call you later. And that was just what he needed to make his decision. And then the actual work of selecting the school will be another whole process later. So yes, sometimes just to have somebody who can say to you, wait before you sign that contract with that company, because I don't know if this particular service is available in Tokyo that your child needs, and let us do some research before you commit to going on that assignment. Or it might be that we say, oh, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And, that's what they need to hear. And we don't say it if it's not true. So,
And if you do want to find out more about Elizabeth and her work, there are links to her website and the educational passport below. And you can also find details of this webinar in the notebook. Thank you so much for joining us, Elizabeth. That has been so helpful. I personally, everything is ticking over now, and I'm heartily glad that we are, touch wood, nearly at the end of this. But I appreciate, because I would have loved to have had your input.
Oh, well, thank you.
Which I have said to pretty much every presenter. I'm doing this summit because I really wish I'd known this before.
Right.
Hopefully, the people watching will avoid all those mistakes that I have made.